I want to begin this one on a grey October morning in 1821, on a road that cuts north through the high moorland above Cumberland, with a man who has not slept properly in 11 days, riding toward a place he chose very deliberately never to think about again. His name was Ashford, James Whitmore, Earl of Wrenmore, and he was not a man who rode 11 days toward anything unless he had been given no other choice by the facts of the matter, and the facts of the matter had very recently become impossible to ignore. He was braced for what he would find at the end of this road, or he believed he was, the way a proud man believes he has prepared himself for something he has never truly imagined. He came over the last rise above the valley of Ravenmere, just as the morning cloud broke apart, and the light came down, and what it fell upon stopped him cold in the saddle. I want you up on that ridge beside him. I want you to see what he saw, because it is the whole hinge of this story, and nothing that comes before or after it makes any sense unless you understand what it meant to a man like Ashford to look down into that valley on that particular morning. He remembered Ravenmere. He had visited it once, 6 years prior, and he had chosen it for a specific purpose, precisely because of what it was. A failing valley in the far north of his holdings, a place of flooded shafts and crumbling cottages, and a village so sunken in poverty and neglect that the people there had stopped expecting anything at all, from any quarter. A lead mine that had been drowning in groundwater for 30 years and producing nothing but expense. Land that had defeated every agent he had ever sent to manage it. He had chosen Ravenmere because it was, of everything he owned, the most comprehensively wretched, the furthest from anyone who mattered, the most thoroughly beyond salvage. He had sent his wife there 18 months ago to be quietly swallowed by it. What lay below him now in the breaking light was not wretchedness. The valley had been re-engineered. That was the only word for it. He could see where the land had been reshaped, new drainage cuts running in precise, calculated lines down the hillsides, pulling the groundwater off and away with an efficiency that made him, who knew his own estates well enough to recognize competent work, sit forward in the saddle. The mine entrance was clear and dry, and there were men going in and out of it with the purposeful, steady rhythm of a working operation. There was new timber shoring he could see from where he sat. The framework of it built with a proportion and care that spoke of someone who understood load and stress, the way most people understand nothing at all. The cottages of the village had been rebuilt, not patched, not propped up, rebuilt, with sound walls and new roofs, and a proportion to them that suggested whoever had designed them knew something about how a human being deserved to live. There was a new school. There was a bridge over the beck, a proper arch bridge, stone with a span that would hold a loaded cart without argument for the next 100 years. There were children in the yard of the school. There was smoke from every chimney in the village. And there, on the hillside above the mine, directing a crew of men who moved with the quick, purposeful eagerness of people who have learned to trust the person giving the instructions, was a woman in a plain, dark coat with a set of survey drawings rolled under one arm, and the unmistakable air of a woman, pointing at something in the rock face above the upper shaft, with the calm, unquestioned authority of someone who has been right enough times that nobody argues with her anymore. He knew her, even at that distance after 18 months. It was his wife. And I am going to stop us there, on the ridge, with the Earl of Wrenmore, staring down at the valley he had chosen as a grave, and finding instead a working enterprise of considerable sophistication, and at the woman commanding it, who was supposed to be a ruin by now, and was instead plainly, and without any question whatsoever, something else entirely. Because before I take him down that hill, you and I have a small piece of business. If you are listening to this beside me tonight, if this story has found you, then I would ask you to find the subscribe button for Moonlight at Bellwood and press it. It costs you nothing, and it means I can find you the next time I have a story worth the telling, and I always have a story worth the telling. If you will not, well, I keep accounts. I am very patient about what I am owed, and I never once forget a balance outstanding. We understand each other. Now, come back with me, because you will want to know what the Earl threw away before you watch him try to reckon with it. Eleanor Voss was not born to be a countess, and if you understand the kind of world she was born into, you will understand exactly why that was simultaneously her greatest disadvantage, and, in the end, her salvation. Her father was Thomas Voss, and Thomas Voss was one of those men the official histories have no room for, because what he did was useful rather than decorative. He was a master shipwright, born the son of a carpenter in Halifax, who came to England at 17, with nothing but a head that understood how things were built and a pair of hands that could execute what the head designed. He spent 40 years building ships, and not merely building them, thinking about them, redesigning them from the waterline up, solving problems of load and stress and material that had defeated men with far grander credentials and far less practical intelligence. By the time Eleanor was born, he was the most sought-after shipwright in 3 counties, and the fortune he had made was considerable and entirely his own, earned out of timber and iron, and the deep understanding of how weight and water and force relate to one another. He had one child, a daughter, and he did with her what shrewd, practical men of his kind sometimes do when they have no son, and a great deal of knowledge to leave behind. He taught her everything. Not the ornamental curriculum. Not the drawing-room accomplishments. He took Eleanor into the yards with him when she was 6 years old, and he began at the beginning, and he did not stop. He taught her to read a survey and understand what it was telling her about the land beneath. He taught her the principles of load-bearing, of drainage, of how water moves through earth and how to redirect it. He taught her to look at a failing structure and understand not just that it was failing, but why, what it needed, what would make it sound. He taught her to manage men, large numbers of them, with the particular combination of firmness and respect that earns genuine cooperation rather than mere compliance. He taught her to run accounts and understand what the numbers were actually saying. He poured into her every practical thing he knew, and he found, to his considerable satisfaction, that she had inherited his particular kind of intelligence whole. By the time she was 23, Eleanor Voss could walk onto any building site or any failing piece of land in England and tell you in 20 minutes what was wrong with it and how to put it right. She could design a drainage system, survey a mine shaft, calculate the span of a bridge, manage a payroll for 200 men, and read a set of geological surveys the way a musician reads a score. It was what she was to her bones. It was the thing that made her feel most alive in the world, the solving of structural problems, the making of broken things sound and functional and true. And then her father died, and the world that had never noticed Eleanor Voss came and found her. A young woman with a large fortune and no male relative to manage it is a thing that a certain class of English society cannot leave alone. They came for her father's money, with all the polished machinery of the English aristocracy, which has been converting merchant wealth into noble bloodlines since the business was first invented. And the man who got her was James Whitmore, Earl of Wrenmore. I will be fair to him, because fairness is what makes a story worth telling. He did not pursue Eleanor Voss out of pure mercenary calculation. He needed money, yes. The Wrenmore earldom was, beneath its considerable surface splendor, encumbered to a degree that kept Ashford awake in the early hours. 3 generations of Whitmores had spent with a cheerful disregard for consequence, and James had inherited a title wrapped around a hollow financial center, and the Voss fortune was exactly the size of the gap. So he offered what he had, a very old name and a very large house, and she gave what she had, and the bargain was struck the way. Such bargains are always struck, with courtesy and mutual avoidance of the words that would make it ugly to say plainly. What nobody said plainly, but everybody inflicted, was this. The Earl of Wrenmore wanted Eleanor Voss's money, and he wanted the heir she might give him, but he did not want Eleanor Voss. He was mildly embarrassed by her. A shipwright's daughter, however wealthy, was not quite what Wrenmore was supposed to be attached to, and that faint embarrassment colored every hour of their marriage in ways that did not require words because they were communicated instead by tone, by careful distance, by the particular quality of silence that a proud man uses to remind a woman that she is tolerated rather than valued. He never saw her. That is the cruelest part, and you must hold it, because it is the thing he has to spend the rest of this story earning his way back from. In nearly 2 years of marriage, James Whitmore, Earl of Wrenmore, never once looked at his wife with sufficient attention to discover that she was one of the most practically gifted people he was ever likely to share a house with. He spent her fortune to clear his debts and looked faintly down on her for having had it to spend. He installed her in Wrenmore Hall and expected her to be an ornament. And Eleanor, who had grown up in shipyards with her sleeves rolled up, who had never been an ornament in her life, and had no particular aptitude for becoming one, found herself locked in a role that used precisely none of what she was. A countess does not survey drainage. A countess does not calculate the load-bearing capacity of failing mine shafts, or redesign the shoring on a crumbling outbuilding. A countess sits in drawing rooms and makes correct conversation, and is decorative and graceful, and says nothing of substance to anyone. Eleanor, who had always been the most substantive person in any room she entered, found herself with her considerable mind running idle and her hands empty, and no one around her who had the faintest interest in what she actually knew how to do. She tried to fit herself to it. "I want that," said. In the early months she tried to learn the particular arts of being a great lady, tried to be what her husband's world required of her, tried even to reach her husband himself, for there were moments in the first year when she glimpsed behind the carefully maintained surface of Lord Ashford, something she might have found worth knowing. A sharp intelligence he rarely used, a loneliness behind the correctness that seemed to her, once or twice, like something that might be spoken to. She reached toward it cautiously, and each time he withdrew behind the armor of his rank and reminded her without a word of what she was and was not, and at last she stopped reaching and folded the small disappointed hope away, somewhere quiet, and settled herself to the long grey prospect of a marriage that would use none of her best qualities for the rest of her life. That is where they were when Lady Cecily Hartley decided to burn the whole arrangement to the ground. Lady Cecily Hartley was everything that Eleanor Voss was not, in the ways that the society of 1820 considered the word everything to mean. She was well-born, fashionable, exquisitely mannered, and she had considered herself the future Countess of Wrenmore for the better part of 4 years before the Whitmore finances had collapsed and James had been forced to go looking for money instead. She had expected him to marry her. She had let the world expect it too. And then he had married the shipbuilder's daughter, and Lady Cecily had smiled at the wedding breakfast and congratulated them both, and spent the better part of a year constructing a way to make Eleanor Voss pay for the presumption of existing. She was patient, and she was thorough, and Eleanor, who had been raised in shipyards among honest men who spoke plainly, had no defenses against the particular weapons of the fashionable world, which are whisper and implication, and the careful staging of appearances. What Lady Cecily built was a story. She built it out of almost nothing, which is the most dangerous kind of story, because almost nothing is impossible to disprove. There was a young civil surveyor who had been engaged to assess some structural work at Wrenmore Hall, a thoroughly respectable professional transaction that Eleanor had managed herself because she was the only person in the house with the knowledge to do it properly. Lady Cecily took that transaction and remade it with forged correspondence and 2 bribed servants and a series of carefully arranged moments observed by carefully prepared witnesses, so that what had been a professional consultation became, in the telling, something that it emphatically was not. The letters that circulated were not Eleanor's. The meetings that were described had not happened as described. But by the time the story had moved through enough drawing rooms, the shape of it was fixed. and Eleanor was fixed inside it. And the whisper that the Earl of Wrenmore's common-born wife had disgraced him with a man she had hired to work on his house was everywhere in the world that mattered to a man like Lord Ashford. Eleanor went to her husband the morning. She understood what was being said of her. She stood in his study, and she told him the truth, clearly and completely, and she asked him to stand beside her and investigate the matter properly, to weigh what he knew of her character against the convenience of a rumor, to give his own wife the simple justice of being heard before being condemned. The Earl of Wrenmore did not believe her. I am not going to soften that or move past it quickly, because it is the real wound in this story, the one beneath all the others, and everything that comes after is shaped by it. He did not believe her, or rather, and I think this is the more exact and more damning truth, he did not trouble to find out whether to believe her. He looked at the appearances Lady Cecily had arranged so carefully, and he looked at his wife, the shipbuilder's daughter he had always been faintly ashamed of, and something in his proud, incurious heart chose the path that required the least from him. He did not investigate. He did not weigh her word against the word of her enemies. He did not give the woman who had cleared his family's debts and given him 18 months of faithful, quiet endurance the basic dignity of an honest inquiry. He banished her. Not a divorce. A divorce was a scandal in itself and a legal complication, and the Voss fortune, it turned out, had been settled in Eleanor's name alone by her father's very careful solicitors and could not be wholly touched in any case, so there was no clean severance available to him. But he could remove her from sight. He could send her somewhere nobody of consequence would ever think to look. He did it coldly, without ceremony, in that flat, precise voice that men of his classes use when they have already made up their minds and do not intend to revisit the decision. She was to go to Ravenmere, the northern estate, the one with the flooded mine and the dying village. She was to remain there. She had disgraced his name, he said. She would now be kept where she could disgrace it no further. He was very quiet about it, very composed. The way one gives instructions for the disposal of something that has become inconvenient. Eleanor did not weep. I have been told she stood very straight and very still, and heard him out, and then said only one thing quietly before she turned and went to pack what was hers. "You have looked at me every day for nearly 2 years," she said, "and you have never once seen what you were looking at. I think perhaps you are about to." Then she went north. Ravenmere in November of 1819 was everything her husband had intended it to be, and nearly everything she had expected, and still it came close to breaking her. Because knowing a place will be hard and arriving in it are two very different experiences. The manor house was cold and badly maintained, several rooms unusable in wet weather, the staff reduced to a handful of dispirited servants who had long since stopped expecting anyone to care about them or the place they served. The village below was grey and quiet, in the particular way of places where hope has been gone so long that the absence of it is no longer even remarkable. The mine entrance was half buried in a slump of saturated earth. The lead operations had been finished for years. She sat in the cold house for a fortnight, and she grieved. Not prettily, not productively. She sat in a draughty room and felt the full weight of what had been done to her, the injustice of it, the loneliness of it, the particular desolation of being condemned without trial by the one person in the world who was supposed to know her. She was 30 years old, and her name was ruined, and she was buried in the north, and there was no one to help her, and the land outside her window was dead. And then one morning she put on her boots and her heaviest coat, and she walked out of the house and down to the mine. She stood at the ruined entrance for a long time, looking at it the way her father had taught her to look at any failing structure. Not as it was, but as it was telling her what it needed. She read the drainage patterns in the hillside above. She read the material of the exposed rock. She walked the perimeter of the flooded shaftards as far as she could go safely. And she looked at the old survey maps she had found in the manor office, and she stood very still in the cold air with all of it moving through the part of her mind that was her father's mind, and she understood. The mine had not failed because the ore was exhausted. The mine had failed because nobody with sufficient knowledge of water and earth and structural engineering had ever been set to the problem of keeping it dry. It was a drainage problem, an engineering problem, the specific kind of problem she had been solving in one form or another since she was 8 years old, sitting beside her father in the yards, learning to read what a structure was asking of you. Her husband had meant to bury her. He had buried her in the one place on earth where she was most precisely herself. She went back to the house, and she sat down at the desk in the cold office, and she opened her father's surveying notebooks, which she had packed without quite knowing why, and she began to work. What she did at Ravenmere over the 18 months that followed is the part of this story I wish I had a week to tell properly, because it deserves to be told slowly and in full, the way a piece of work of that quality deserves to be respected. I cannot give it that tonight, but I can give you enough. She drained the mine first. Surveyed the hillside herself in all weathers, mapping the water table, calculating the gradient, designing the drainage system from first principles, with the particular clarity that her father had always said was her great gift, the ability to see what wanted doing, without the fog of assumption about what was and was not possible. She hired the men of the village to dig it, paying them honest wages out of the Voss Trust Fund, which remained hers absolutely under the terms of her father's settlement, and which the Earl of Wrenmore had not been able to touch. She had spent 18 months in London being an ornament. She now had 18 months of a ruined estate to make sound, and she spent her father's money on it the way her father had spent his knowledge, without hesitation and without waste. The drainage system worked. Of course it did. She had designed it. The shafts cleared. She brought in a mining engineer from Durham, a man named Carver, who took one look at her survey drawings and her structural calculations, and then looked at her for a long moment with the particular expression of a professional who has just realized he is in the presence of someone who knows what they are doing and who had not expected that. She told him what she needed in terms precise enough that there was no ambiguity, and Mr. Carver, a sensible man, did not argue. The mine reopened. While the drainage was being completed, she turned her attention to the village. The cottages were not merely in poor repair, they were badly conceived at their foundations, built by people who did not understand how to manage damp ground or prevailing wind, or the specific load problems of the local stone. She redesigned them. She did not impose the designs from a distance. She sat down with the people of Ravenmere, who had been suspicious of her at first, with the flat, careful wariness of folk who have been disappointed too many times to offer trust easily, and she listened to them, and she learned what the houses needed to do for the specific lives being lived in them, and then she designed buildings that answered those needs. She taught the men of the village to build them, working alongside them in all weathers, in her plain coat with her notebooks and her surveying tools and her father's way of explaining a principle so that the person learning it understood the reason and not merely the instruction. They did not call her the Countess. After the first 3 months, they began calling her, among themselves, Miss Voss, as though they understood, without being told, that the name she had arrived with was the one that counted. She did not correct them. She built a school. She built the bridge over the beck, the proper, stone arch bridge that would carry loaded carts safely, which the village had needed for 20 years, and which every previous land agent had dismissed as unnecessary expense. She redesigned the mine's surface works, the separation house, the storage, the drainage runoffs, so that the operation ran more efficiently and lost less to water damage and weather. 18 months after Eleanor Voss arrived at Ravenmere, expecting to die quietly of uselessness in a cold house, Ravenmere was running the most productive lead operation in the northern part of the county, and the unmistakable air of a woman with a village of sound houses and a working school and a bridge that the men of 3 neighbouring parishes came to look at with quiet, professional envy, and a workforce that would have followed her into a collapsing shaft if she had asked them to. 2 things reached Lord Ashford in the south, one after the other, and between them they put him on the road north. The first was the accounts. Ravenmere had been a drain on the Wrenmore finances for as long as anyone could remember, a consistent annual loss that the estate managers had long since learned not to discuss in terms that might prompt questions. And then the accounts from the autumn of 1821 came in, and they showed something that made Ashford's man of business come to him personally with the papers in his hand and an expression of genuine perplexity on his face. Ravenmere was not merely profitable. It was his most productive single holding, by a margin that was not close. The mine was running at a volume that had not been seen in a generation. The estate had been substantially rebuilt. There was a bridge. There was a school. Improving men from 3 counties had come to study the drainage works. Ashford read the accounts and found he did not know what to do with what they were telling him. And then the second thing came, and the second thing undid him. One of Lady Cecily Hartley's bribed servants had carried the guilt of what she had done for 18 months, and guilt of that weight eventually finds a way out. She went to a magistrate. She brought what she could prove, and she confessed what she knew. And what she could prove and what she knew was the whole of Lady Cecily's construction. The forged letters, the prepared witnesses, the careful manufacture of a scandal from nothing, from a professional consultation, made to look like something it was not, built with malice and patience by a woman who had decided that Eleanor Voss needed to be destroyed for the crime of marrying a man she had wanted. The proof reached Ashford, and he sat with it in his hands in his study in Wrenmore Hall, and the full shape of what he had done assembled itself in front of him with a clarity that allowed no comfortable evasion. His wife had been innocent. He had sent an innocent woman, his own wife, the woman who had cleared his family's debts, and given him not a single genuine cause for complaint, to rot in a flooded wasteland, without investigation, without fairness, without even the most basic courtesy of being heard, because his incurious, proud heart had found it easier to believe the convenient story than to look carefully at the woman he had married. He did not sleep. A man of Ashford's temperament, when the armor of his self-regard is finally cracked through, does not sleep because the thoughts that come in through the crack will not let him. He lay awake in his well-appointed house for 3 nights, and at the end of the 3rd night, he got up and called for his horse. He rode north braced for what he deserved to find. A woman broken by 18 months of exile in a place chosen for its capacity to break people, a wasted estate, a ruin that he had made. He came over the ridge above Ravenmere Valley and found what I have already described to you. And he sat his horse on the ridge in the breaking morning light, and could not make it fit into any version of the world he had brought north with him. The valley was not broken. The valley was, by any measure he possessed, flourishing. And the woman on the hillside above the mine was not broken. She was pointing at something in the upper rock face with the easy authority of someone who has been right so many times that the expectation of being right has simply become part of how she stands, and the men around her moved with a willing speed that told you everything you needed to know about how she had earned their regard. He rode down the hill. It was the longest descent of his life. He passed the new bridge. He passed the sound cottages with their well-designed proportions. He passed the school where a woman was teaching a roomful of children who were unmistakably paying attention. He passed men who looked at him with the particular flat, unrevealing regard of people who know exactly who you are and have already formed a view of you, and who are too certain of where they stand to feel the need to perform anything for your benefit. He came to the hillside, to the group of men, to the edge of what they were doing, and Eleanor Voss finished what she was saying to the man beside her. with the complete unhurried attention of someone who does not allow external interruptions to affect the quality of her work. And then she turned her horse and walked it the few steps to where he had stopped, and she looked at him. He had been rehearsing this moment for 11 days of riding. He had composed and discarded a dozen approaches. He had nothing useful left. She looked at him across the distance between them, and her face was quite still, and she said, without particular inflection, "My lord, you appear to have come a considerable way from the south. I hope it was worth the journey." It was not warm, it was not cold. It was the tone of a person who is entirely certain of who she is and what she is standing in, and who requires nothing from the person in front of her. He said her name. He said it the wrong way, stumbling on it, and tried again. He told her he had seen the valley from the ridge. She waited. He said he had come because he knew the truth about Lady Cecily Hartley, that he had the proof of the whole scheme, that he knew she had been innocent from the beginning, that he knew he had condemned her, without a fair hearing, without investigation, without so much as the ordinary consideration one would give to a dispute between strangers. Something moved behind her composure then. Not tears. Eleanor Voss had not cried since the first fortnight of her arrival, and she had made a particular, private peace with herself that she was not going to cry in front of this man. It was something quieter than tears and harder. It was the look of an old wound being shown the light. "You came to me," she said. Her voice was level and there was iron in it. "I stood in your study and I told you the truth and I asked you to stand beside me. And you looked at me and you decided it was easier to believe a woman who despised me, because you had always considered me beneath serious attention, and reconsidering that position was more trouble than it was worth." He did not answer immediately, which was, she reflected afterward, the first genuinely correct instinct he had displayed in their acquaintance. "You understand," she continued, "that Lady Cecily's deception is not the primary thing you need to account for. Lady Cecily built a lie. Lies are built every day. What you are accountable for is something you did entirely without her assistance. You had a wife for nearly 2 years. You had 18 months of evidence about who that wife was, how she conducted herself, what her character amounted to. And when a crisis came, you did not draw on any of it. You did not weigh it. You did not even look for it. You heard a story that fitted comfortably with the low opinion you had always quietly maintained, and you acted on it because it was convenient. That is not Lady Cecily's fault. That is yours alone." Lord Ashford dismounted. He got down from his horse there on the hillside, which was not a small gesture for a man of his precise and carefully maintained dignity, and he stood on the ground below where she sat her horse, and he said, "Yes, you are right. All of it." He told her what he had never said plainly to anyone, perhaps not to himself, until the 3 sleepless nights that had finally forced him to look at his own interior directly, that he had been raised to a single governing value which was the maintenance of the Wrenmore name, and that value had crowded out nearly every other, including the ordinary human obligations of fairness and attention and the willingness to truly see the person beside you, that he had married her for money, and had never troubled to look past the transaction to the person it involved, that he had looked out his study window for 3 nights, and understood that he had committed an injustice that could not be quietly corrected or attributed to circumstance, that it was his, entirely, the product of nothing but his own incuriosity and pride. He said, "I rode north expecting to find what I deserved to find. I came over the ridge and found this instead, and I understood, looking down at what you have made here, the full measure of what I failed to see when I was looking directly at you every day." She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked him, in the direct practical voice that was simply how she spoke, what exactly he had come to do. Whether he had come to reclaim the profitable estate. Whether he had come to collect a wife who had turned out, unexpectedly, to have value. She asked him to be honest about it, because she had had enough of the alternative. He said, "I have not come for the mine. Keep it. You made it. I would not touch it. I have not come to collect you as though you were a piece of property that has appreciated. He said, I have come because I rode over that ridge braced to look upon a ruin I had made, and I found the most precisely capable person I have ever encountered in my life, ruling a valley she rebuilt from its foundations, beloved by every man and woman in it, requiring nothing from anyone, least of all from me. And I understood, on that ridge, that I had spent 2 years in the same house as that person, and had never once looked at her. His voice was not steady. It was, she observed, the first time she had ever heard it be otherwise. He said he had come to do the one thing he could still do that was worth anything. He would take the proof of Lady Cecily Hartley's scheme to London, and he would lay it before the world that had condemned Eleanor, completely and publicly, and he would spend whatever remained of the Wrenmore name doing it. He would clear her reputation not in exchange for anything, not as a negotiation, but because it was owed to her and had been owed to her since the morning he had sent her away without a fair hearing, and he intended to pay the debt whether she asked him to or not, and whether she ever wished to see him again afterward or not. Eleanor looked at him for a long time. Then she swung down from her horse and came to stand level with him on the ground. On the hillside she had drained and reshaped and made lands, and she looked at him at the same height on the same ground, and she said, You will clear my name because it is owed, not as a gift, not as a bargain, because it was owed 2 years ago, and the debt has been accumulating interest since. Agreed, he said. You will expect nothing in return. You will go to London and do what needs doing, and you will return here afterward, with no assumption about what you may be owed for it. Agreed. She was quiet for another moment. The men on the hillside above had found something very absorbing to do with the rock face, and were doing it with considerable concentration. Then, she said, if you come back, you will not come back as the Earl of Wrenmore arriving to inspect his holdings. You will come back as a man who has a very great deal to learn and considerably less time than he would wish in which to learn it. You will work on this land properly on my terms, and the terms of the people here who have earned the right to have opinions about who enters this valley. You will learn what I know the way I learned it, which is from the ground up, with your hands, without the protection of rank or prior assumption. You valued your name above your wife once. You will spend a long while demonstrating that you have genuinely reconsidered those priorities. She looked at him steadily. I will not be one with fine words, she said. I have heard adequate numbers of those. I am a practical woman, my lord, and I was raised by a practical man, and what I understand is work and time, and whether the results are sound. If you want to learn to be worth something to me, that is how you will do it. Slowly, on this ground, in all weathers, with your results as the only evidence that counts. She allowed a pause. You came north, expecting to find a woman you had broken. I think you can see clearly enough that you did not break me. What you will discover, if you have the patience and the honesty for it, is whether the man behind 18 months of shame and 1 very long northern ride is worth the knowing. I have caught a glimpse of something behind that pride of yours, once or twice, that I did not think was entirely without possibility. Whether that something has survived what your pride has cost you, I cannot tell you yet. Win me, Lord Ashford, the way I won this mine, with steady, honest work, and no promises about results until the results can speak for themselves. She turned back toward her men on the hillside. You may stay in the manor tonight, she said, over her shoulder, with the same pleasant practicality she might have used about any logistical arrangement. We can discuss the details in the morning, when the light is better. I have work to finish before the evening. He went south. He did what he had promised, and he did it without condition, laid the whole of Lady Cecily Hartley's scheme before the world in a way that could not be misread, stood up in rooms full of people who had spent 2 years repeating the slander, and declared plainly and without decorative language that his wife had been falsely accused. that the accusation had been manufactured from malice, and that he had compounded the original injustice by failing to look for the truth when it was his duty to do so. He said the last part without being asked to. It cost him something, and he said it anyway, and that was the thing Eleanor later acknowledged had surprised her. He came back to Ravenmere. He stayed. He learned, and it took him longer than he would have wished, which was appropriate. He learned the land from her, who understood it better than any man on the estate. He learned the mine from the men who worked it, who warmed to him slowly and conditionally, and on the basis of whether he was actually useful, rather than whether he was the Earl, which was a standard that required real adjustment on his part. He learned what it felt like to be judged entirely on the quality of his work, with rank counting for precisely nothing, and he found, after the first months of discomfort, that it was a clarifying way to live. Eleanor watched him learn. She kept her own counsel about what she saw, which was her way. But the man who had glimpsed something possible in her husband, early on and briefly, began to find the glimpse confirmed by evidence, which is the only kind of confirmation that had ever meant anything to her, behind the burned-away pride. There was, indeed, a man of real intelligence, capable of genuine change when the conditions for it had been made sufficiently uncomfortable and sufficiently inescapable, which she was willing to admit was a description that applied to most people when you got down to it. They came to love each other. Not quickly, and not easily, and not in the way of a story that tidies itself into a bow, but in the real way, the way that grows out of honest acquaintance and shared work and enough difficulty to establish that the thing between you is actual rather than convenient. They governed Ravenmere together, the shipwright's daughter and the reformed Earl, and they made it one of the most talked-about estates in the north of England, which was satisfying to both of them in different ways, and for the same underlying reason. And Lord Ashford, who had spent his life in the careful stewardship of a name that turned out to be worth rather less than he had believed, lived to understand that the thing most worth protecting is not a title or a reputation, or any arrangement that can be maintained by other people's deference. It is the person beside you in all weathers, the one who can walk out into a ruined situation and see, with her father's eyes, what it is asking of her, and give it exactly that. He had sent her to Ravenmere to disappear. She had built something there instead, the way practical people with a genius in their hands always will, given a free hand and enough difficult ground to work with. There is no exiling a person who carries their knowledge inside them. You may send them as far as you like from everything they have known, and they will simply find the materials nearest to hand and begin. If this story has given you anything tonight, a warmth or a steadiness, or a quiet certainty that the gift in your own hands is not something the world can take from you, no matter what it tries, then I would ask you to subscribe to Moonlight at Bellwood, because there are more of these, and they all have a heart, and I would very much hate for you to miss a single one. Good night, my dears. If ever someone tries to put you somewhere they think you will be forgotten, you look carefully at what they have given you to work with. You may be surprised what is waiting there to be made.